Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I'm going to be walking you through some popular fantasy series that I have zero interest in reading. The great thing about kind of understanding what you love in your books is that you also understand what you don't like in your books, whether that's tropes, writing styles, character types, whatever it may be. You really start to get an idea of when a book or a series might really appeal to your particular preferences. Without a doubt, when I started reading more fantasy and sci-fi, however many years ago now it was, probably about 5-6 years ago, all of these series were on my list. I even had physical copies of some of these books, but I've ended up either selling them on or giving them to people that I know. And I genuinely have no interest in picking any of these series up. This has nothing to do with the authors themselves. This has nothing to do with them as people. It's purely because I think I have a pretty good understanding of what I like in my books now. And from what I've heard about these books and from what I've read about these books I don't think will appeal to me, and I just don't think I will enjoy them. So without further ado, let's jump in. I think I have about 10 series on this list. So yeah, let's jump in. And these are not ranked, as another disclaimer. So the first series on this list is the Poppy War Trilogy, with the first book being The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I think this is an author that is just not for me. I think The Poppy War, I remember it being so hyped when it first came out. I remember everybody and their mother was talking about it. A lot of people were giving it 5 stars, but then there was also, I would say, a smaller subset of people who didn't really enjoy the overall trilogy. But I just remember everybody talking about it at one point. Like when it first came out, and then whenever the subsequent books came out, there was always a lot of people on YouTube talking about it. This is one that I was pretty interested in purely because it is, from what I understand, quite dark. And I do believe there are some historical elements to this series as well, which is not necessarily something that I actively seek out, but I do appreciate when an author does it well. The reason why I've decided to take this off my list, and generally I think this author off my list, is even though, yes, this series was a debut series, which in my opinion is not an excuse for like poorly written characters or anything like that. To be fair, I am willing to be a bit more forgiving. But from what I've heard, this is a series that I think I will find quite frustrating. And that's mainly for two reasons. I think the first reason that I've commonly heard is that the main character is actually not that well fleshed out. The character has depth in the sense that there is an inciting incident at the beginning of book 1 that causes this character to then go on a path of revenge. But I've heard that it's not very well realised, it's not very well written, which is something that I personally can't forgive, because that's a motivation that I like for characters so much. As we all know, I read a decent amount of grimdark, and I think I have a pretty good understanding of what I like in my grimdark, and I don't like characters that are very singular and that feel very kind of narrow-minded. And that's what I've heard as it relates to the main character of this book. I've also heard that this book tries to be quite edgy, where it really doesn't need to be. And that's also something that I can't forgive when it comes to fantasy in general, but in particular when it comes to grimdark fantasy. So this is a series that, whilst I can totally appreciate the amount of discourse that it kind of provided to the booktube community and the book community in general when it first came out, it's a series that I simply have no interest in reading. The next one is a series that I really liked the sound of the vibe, and obviously vibe is not something that you can quantify. I do quite like books that have a seafaring element, and so that is why this series was on my list. And that is the Tide Child Trilogy, with the first book being The Bone Ships by R.J. Barker. Now, the reason why I decided to take this off my list is because I heard the female characters are incredibly poorly written. Now, that is something that I can forgive when it comes to older fantasy. It's something that I can forgive when I read a series that was maybe written 100 years ago, even 50 years ago. I will be a bit more forgiving of it. I am less forgiving of it when it's happening in the 21st century. And whilst I like the sound of aspects of this series, particularly the seafaring element of it, I don't love it that much that I'm so desperate to read a poorly written female character. So that's simply the reason why I don't want to read it. It's such a shame, because I do quite enjoy it, and I quite enjoy like pirates and stuff in my fantasy, but it is what it is. The next one is an author that I've actually read before, and I really enjoyed the book that I read, and I'm really excited to see how that series develops. But the series that I've decided that I'm not going to read, and I actually ended up selling the copy that I owned, is the Lazarus Trilogy, with the first book being The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. Now, I really enjoyed his most recent book. I think it was fantastic, and I'm so excited to read the second book. But this series, I've heard, is not particularly well written. I've heard that it's pretty janky. Again, in the author's defense, it is a debut series, the first book being his first book that he's ever written, from what I understand. But at the same time, I don't think that should necessarily excuse poorly written fiction, in my opinion. Whilst I'm glad he wrote that series to then be able to write The Will of the Many, which is fantastic, and I think is actually quite well written, I don't really have any particular proclivity to read a book or a series that's just not particularly well mapped out. From what I've heard from people, the pacing is quite rough, the character development isn't that great, and I don't think the world building is also that great. Now, obviously, I haven't read it, so I can't really attest to those claims, but this is just from reading comments on Goodreads, but also speaking to people that I know that have also read this series, and they're generally people whose opinions that I trust. This is a series that I think at one point I would have loved to have given it a go, but there's so many books to read that I just don't think I want to dedicate time reading a series that has pretty chunky books. And look, the author has an amazing series currently running, so I'm happy to give my time, attention, and money to that instead. The next one is a series that I remember when I first heard about it, I was like, yes, I love assassin fantasy. Like, I love it when you're following assassins and they're doing stuff, and it's great. I used to love that trope. I don't hate that trope particularly, but it's also a trope that I think is incredibly overdone. And so the Night Angel trilogy, with the first book being The Night Angel by Brent Weeks, is a series that I've decided to take off my list. I would like to read his other series, which is Lightbringer, at some point in the future, but I did also hear that series did not end very well. But this is a series that I think, in his defense, was probably like kind of at the peak of assassin fantasy, because I feel like there was a period of time where like every single fantasy book coming out, every other fantasy series that was coming out had some sort of assassin element to it. So naturally, authors are potentially going to lean into certain trends. But just right now, like, I've read a decent amount of assassin fantasy, and I have no interest in reading it anymore, unless it's like a fresh take, which from what I understand, this is not. Then we have another series which I remember a lot of people positioning it as a kind of alternative to Harry Potter, like a darker version of Harry Potter. And that is the Magicians Trilogy, with the first book being The Magicians by Lev Grossman. Lev Grossman actually has a new series that has started. I think the first book came out either last year or this year, which I am quite keen to pick up. But this is a series that I think I would have loved like 10 years ago. And I would have really enjoyed it kind of for what it was, because it's like an academic setting. I believe our main character is an orphan, and like he's kind of discovering his powers, and he's trying to figure out how to realize those powers sustainably. And that's stuff that I do really enjoy, but I think I've got to the point where I'm past, not necessarily caring, I'm just not interested in it anymore. Like that type of trope, like the orphan boy figuring out his powers and coming to terms with that, having a found family. Those kind of tropes are things that I do like independently of one another, if that makes sense, but not necessarily together, because I just feel like we're rehashing the same stuff. This was a series that I think was written like 10, 15 years ago. So it's not new by any means, but I think I've got past the point where I'm past kind of reading that sort of story again. That might change though. I just think at this moment in time, I'm not interested. The next one is a series that I really love, the game. And you might have guessed what it is now. The game is incredible. Like, it's so good. But the series I have zero interest in reading, especially because the TV show really put me off it. And then certain comments that I'd heard about the series really put me off it as well. And that is the Witcher series, with the first book being The Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski. And this is a series that I've heard really, really bad things about as it relates to the female characters, and how a lot of them feel very one-dimensional, and that they are basically just objects, and that they are just not very well developed, which again is not something that I'm particularly okay with reading anymore, because I just don't think there's any excuse for it. I mean, admittedly, these books are reasonably old, but at the same time, I don't care enough. Like, I'm not that desperate to read it that I'm gonna like read badly written characters. Like, I think the game does the female characters really well. I'll just happily replay the game rather than read the books or watch the TV show, which was absolutely terrible decision to take out the OG Geralt. I mean, that series wasn't great from the start, let's be completely honest, but I think it really shows when the actor loves the IP, when they like really love like the characters and the story and they're familiar with it. Like, I really do think it shows. Like, he played Geralt perfectly, in my opinion, even if everything else was cheesy and like pretty poorly done, in my opinion. I think the decision to remove him from the TV show was terrible and has kind of put me off the IP in general, aside from the game, which I think is incredible. Like, it's so good. I wouldn't mind actually replaying it, but I don't know if I have time to sink another like 70 hours into it when I have so many other games to play. Who knows? Then we have another series that I don't want to read because of the female characters being poorly characterized, and that is the Dron Files, with the first book being Stormfront by Jim Butcher. Jim Butcher has another series that I'd really like to read, which is the Codex Alera series. I've heard really good things about that series, and I've heard that a lot of the issues in the Dron Files are not in Codex Alera. Let me know down below if you have read both, whether you agree with that. But this is a series that I've just heard absolutely shocking things about how it relates to the main character and how he perceives women. Apparently it improves by the end of the series, but again, it's a long series. I think there's like 10 books or something. Like, do I really want to read 5 books to get to the point where the character isn't an absolute douchebag? Probably not. Got a ton of other books that I want to read first. It's kind of annoying as well, because I actually had the first couple of books of that series. I did end up selling them, so it was fine. But it is a series that I would have liked to have read, just because I do like detective kind of fantasy, as I like the idea of it at the very least. And this is kind of one of the ones that comes up the most when you talk about detective fantasy. It is what it is. I'm not going to lose sleep over it, but I think it's a bit of a shame, to be honest. And then the next one, we have 3 left. We have a series that I was so gutted when I heard that it had a multitude of issues, and I'll walk through those issues in a minute. But the series is The Chronicle of the UNH Throne. What an amazing title for a series, right? Amazing title for a series. With the first book being The Emperor's Blades by Brian Staveley. I heard that this series is pretty poorly written. I've heard that the pacing is not great. I've also heard that the female characters are super one-dimensional and that it's a bit convoluted in places, and those are all things that I'm just not interested in reading. I love the sound of the plot of this series. Like, I love the idea of like siblings fighting against each other to get the throne. If anybody has any recommendations relating around that plot, let me know. But I love the sound of that plot. Like, it's something that I would eat up if done well. So this one was actually, I was quite upset that I wasn't going to read it, because I just heard so much negativity around it that I just thought, okay, maybe it's best for me to stay away from this one, unfortunately. And then the next one that we have is kind of similar to the Magicians in the sense that it follows a lot of the same tropes, is the Traitor's Sun Cycle, with the first book being The Red Knight by Miles Cameron. Miles Cameron is an author that I really want to read more of. I've not read any of his stuff, but I own quite a few of his books, and I'm really excited to pick them up. But this is a series that again, you're following, I think, like an orphan boy. So I think it is like YA, and he's, again, got magical powers. He's discovering those magical powers, and then there's like an empire at war, and he plays a really important role in resolving the conflict in that empire. Like, again, it's very typical fantasy, I would say, like classic fantasy, I would say. I've heard that the story plotting in this book is really poorly done. I don't know much more beyond that, but I think I've heard really great things about Cameron's other books. Like, there's a few of his historical fiction that I really want to read and that I will definitely get to. And I think he did also a book on Alexander the Great that I really want to read, which I do own. Yeah, I have it. I can see it from my bookshelf over there. So that is definitely one I want to pick up. But again, I've just heard that it's very samey. The characters are quite one-dimensional. And for me, like, poor plotting when it's meant to be like a story-driven book, which I believe this is supposed to be, gonna give it a pass, unfortunately. And then the final one is a series that was all the rage a couple of years ago, and I did buy the first book. And I kind of regret buying the first book because I do actually have all the books on ebook now. I got them like super cheap on ebook. So that does mean that there is the potential that I might give it a go at some point in the future. So this one I'm a bit more lukewarm on compared to the other 9 that I've listed. But I'm not really sure whether I am going to read it. And that is the books of Babel Quartet, with the first book being Sennan Ascends by Josiah Bancroft. Josiah Bancroft is an author that I'm actually quite interested in reading. He has a newish book that I think came out last year, and I do actually own it, and I am quite keen to read it. But I just think Sennan is a series that I've heard so much about that I just don't want to read it. You know when like you've heard so much about a series or a book or a particular author, and you're just kind of fed up of hearing about it? Like that's kind of where I'm at with this series. Like I've just heard so many people talking about it, positively, negatively, somewhere in the middle, which is great because you're probably going to get that with most series. I've almost had like overexposure, like it's been exposed to me so much that I've just now put off it, and I ended up selling the physical edition that I had, and I find it highly unlikely that I'm going to end up reading this series, even though I think there's some interesting themes that are explored in this series, and I also quite like the idea of the kind of main plot, but I think the expectation in my head is quite high, and I just have a feeling that it's going to end up not meeting those expectations. And I know that probably sounds quite silly, but like I genuinely think that's just as a direct result of just being so exposed to it that I'm just kind of fed up of hearing about it, and I just don't want to read it as a result of that. Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at with that one. Again, I own them on ebook, so maybe at some point in the future, far into the future, I might end up picking it up, but at the very least, in the immediate term, I have no interest in picking it up. So there we have it. Those are 10 popular fantasy series that I have zero interest in reading. Let me know down below if there's any series that have been, you know, particularly hyped over the years that you've just decided to put off reading for one reason or another. Like, let me know down below what are the reasons. And yeah, I think this is always quite an interesting conversation because as you read more books, your tastes, I think, become more solidified. And by solidifying your taste, you're then able to eliminate books or series that are no longer aligned with those tastes, which is an ever evolving experience and process. So I'm sure at some point in the future, I'll end up doing this again because you're always learning what you like and what you dislike. And those tastes also change over time as well, right? So let me know down below and I will see you there. Thanks for watching, folks. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up and I will see you in my next one. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, take care, and I will see you very soon.